Okay, so this evening I'd like to welcome Professor Stuart Reynolds from the University of Bath. I saw a version of this presentation at the Royal Entomological Society conference last year, and I was absolutely fascinated. So I cornered Stuart in the lunch break and asked him if he would present it at Ento Live. So really pleased to hear Stuart speaking about this today, and it's a bit longer today, so I might learn a bit more as well. So over to you, Stuart.
Uh, well, good evening, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yeah, loud and clear.
Great. Excellent. Good evening, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. It's really gratifying that there are so many people who are interested in insects. In my talk today, I want to talk about the very few insects that live in the sea, what kind of insects they are and why there are so few of them. I'll often refer to insects and their close wingless relatives during the talk as hexapods, because unlike all other animals, they have 6 legs. Well, it's always a good idea to start with what Charles Darwin had to say about almost any biological question. Darwin indeed knew quite a bit about marine insects. He spent 5 years at sea circumnavigating the globe on HMS Beagle, and he used every available moment in collecting biological specimens. And as a more than competent entomologist, he would surely have found some marine insects if they were there, wouldn't he? Well, in fact, in his best-selling travelogue, The Voyage of the Beagle, Darwin hardly mentions the subject. But he did, in fact, find some. On February the 16th, 1832, Darwin put ashore on the remote St. Paul's Rocks, a tiny archipelago in the middle of the Atlantic, 870 kilometres from the coast of South America. And, well, there it is, look. Let's use the laser pointer. There it is, in between Africa and South America. It's hundreds of kilometres from the nearest island. He found this little tiny archipelago to be biologically barren. And in his journal, he noted not a single plant, not even a lichen grows on this islet, and yet it's inhabited by several insects and spiders. And the reason for this is that the rocks are inhabited by a vast multitude of nesting seabirds. They're brown boobies, Sula leucogaster. And among the several kinds of insect he found in and around the nests of those birds was an ectoparasitic hippoboscid, often called a lousefly. These specimens are unfortunately now lost, but it was probable that that insect was this biting fly, Olfersia enescens. It occurs widely at low latitudes and it's frequently associated with seabirds. And although it has functional wings, it very rarely flies or indeed leaves the host at all. Darwin also found a tick at the same site. Ticks aren't insects, but they're nearly insects. This tick was also associated with seabird nests. Unfortunately, the tick specimen that Darwin collected has also not survived. It might have been the hard tick Ixodes urei, but a more likely candidate is a soft tick Carios capensis, which has since been recorded from the same location. And both of these ticks specialise in parasitising seabirds and use the brown booby as a host. Now, this little story illustrates the essence of what I'm going to unfold in this lecture, which is that many apparently marine insects and their relatives are actually not marine at all. They're just hanging on to the land in the middle of the sea. And Darwin probably didn't even bother to look in the sea for insects, because in 1832 he knew, as a knowledgeable naturalist, that there weren't any marine insects. Right from the very first serious studies of insects from the time of the Renaissance onwards, everybody knew that insects were generally absent from the sea. Victorian naturalists were particularly keen on exploring the seashore, and it was axiomatic to them that very few insects lived in or on or near the sea. this chap, Philip Goss, was a superstar of mid-19th century nature writing. He operated on every level from serious zoology, like this book here, to children's books. And in his best-selling book of 1855, Marine Zoology, Goss commented, "It has frequently been said that no true insect is marine. And though this is not literally true, the minuteness of the exception makes the rule even more striking than it would have been if absolutely universal." And that's what Darwin would have thought. No insects in the sea, let's not bother to look for them, it's a waste of time. But in fact, there are some marine insects, and the first of them to be noticed in print was this one here. It's a carabid beetle, Epus marinus. And this discovery actually takes us back to the late 18th century in 1783. But it took time for the news to spread. It was originally published in an obscure Norwegian book. Epus lives on the seashore. Like other carabids, it's a predator, and it feeds on small arthropods, insects, actually wingless insects, such as springtails. And when the tide rises, this carabid retreats into underwater pockets of air in rock crevices and under stones, and it only emerges to forage when the water retreats. And the Norwegian entomologist Hans Ström originally described this species actually from a shore in Denmark, and he called it Cicindela marina. And then he changed his mind, and only 5 years later he republished it as Carabus marinus. And this description again was published only in a book about Norwegian natural history. And although Darwin was a very keen coleopterist, it seems very unlikely that he knew about it. The same insect was rediscovered on French shores by this chap, Jean-Victor Audouin, in 1822, although his paper didn't actually get published until 1833, by which time Darwin and the beagle were already in Brazil, and so Darwin wouldn't have been able to see that paper. Importantly, Audouin noted that the beetle carries a bubble of air under its elytra, enabling it to breathe when it's underwater. The same species was recorded in England by a chap called William Elford Leach, who described it in 1823 as Epus fulvescens. And Darwin could conceivably have known about that, but perhaps he hadn't noticed the paper. Only later was it realized that Epus fulvescens was actually the same as the previously described Danish insect. So the proper name, according to the rules of nomenclature, is the one that Ström gave it as Epus marinus. One of the most influential of early entomologists, William Spence, penned a short paper about this in 1836. I've shown you this here. It's actually in the Royal Entomological Society's Transactions, the very first volume. And his paper, still called Epus fulvescens, Kirby noted that this carabid had other relatives that appeared also to be able to live when submerged by seawater, and he wrote, "It would be well deserving of further investigation how far all these insects are constantly surrounded with an air bubble, and whether there's ground for believing that it's alternately decomposed and renewed, as Monsieur Audouin supposes." But Darwin wouldn't have been able to read Spence's paper either until after his return home from his round-the-world voyage. So Darwin didn't know very much about marine insects, just about those ones that occurred on the St. Paul's rocks. But just a few 19th century entomologists were really inspired by all of this stuff, and particularly by the work of Audouin, and they went out looking for more examples of marine insects. And by the end of the 19th century, this chap, the Belgian Felix Plateau, was able to collect a list of 53 species of marine insects that were then known from European sites. Now, his criterion for including them in his list was that these were species that were at least sometimes inundated by the tide, and most of them, like Epus marinus, were carabids. But he also noted that there were 6 species of specialized springtails that lived close to the sea, and these are very prominent. Actually, if you go and walk about on the beach where there are some rocks, you'll certainly see them. And it seems astonishing that it took so long for people to realize that these were special to the sea. Also, Plateau recognized a single species of marine hemipteran. These are true bugs. This one's called Epophilus bonnerii. And so, he's building up some knowledge of marine insects, but astonishingly, Plateau took the decision to exclude all 2-winged flies or diptera from his list. And in his paper, he noted that there were large numbers of dipteran larvae that lived close to the sea and sometimes or even often got wet. But because the adult stages of these larvae avoided getting wet, he said, well, they're not marine insects. He discounted them. This tendency of dipterists to be interested only in the adult stage is a bit of a hobby horse of mine. Why do they do it? I can only think that it's because they feel that the maggoty larvae of flies all look rather similar and they're not very interesting. Well, they may look the same, but in fact, dipteran larvae are ecologically extremely adaptable, and they may well account for the terrific evolutionary success of the order Diptera. Anyway, that's a story for another day. But returning to the story of marine insects, as we shall see in a minute, the flies are in fact the order of insects that are most often associated with the sea. We know a lot more about marine insects now than we did 125 years ago, but the list of the names of those marine insects is still a pretty short one. Most of what we know is summarized in this absolutely terrific book published almost 50 years ago in 1976, edited by the doyenne of marine insect researchers, Professor Lana Cheng of the Scripps Institute in San Diego in California. It's still the first resort for anyone who's interested in this subject. It's rather an old book now, so you might have to search hard to get it. But luckily, it's actually available online, and I think that you'll get a link for that. And in her 1976 book, Lana guessed that there might be a total of as many as several hundred species of marine or intertidal insects. The vast majority of those, however, would have to be described as at best only part-time marine insects because they don't live all of their lives in the briny. Lana is best known for her work on the only full-time marine insects, a handful of species that are members of the hemipteran genus Halobates, which spend their entire lives on the open oceans of the tropics. And we'll come back to Halobates rather much later in this talk. So in that 1976 book, Lana Cheng and her colleagues had begun the task of cataloguing the insects that live in or near the sea. 47 years later, when I set out to write a review article on marine insects for the Royal Entomological Society's magazine Antenna, then I wanted to update Lana's guesswork to provide a much better estimate of how many marine associated insects there are. And this was made much easier for me by the existence of an absolutely wonderful resource enjoyed by students of marine life. This is the worms database. It's not about worms, it's actually the World Register of Marine Species. And if you don't know about this tool, then I can recommend it to you. You can find it easily just by Googling the worms database. It's available for anyone to use free of charge. And this slide shows the front page of the website. And what I did was to interrogate worms to find all of the hexapod species that had been recorded in marine environments. Remember, hexapods are insects and their wingless allies. And what happens next? Oh yes, here we go. I drew up a list of the outputs. So this is what I got when I queried hexapods, 1,278 species. And of those, I went through them all and I accepted only those that were tagged as marine or brackish, and I rejected all the species that were tagged as fresh or terrestrial. Previous attempts to draw up a list of this kind have been marred by the failure to exclude these other species that creep in. I also added additional marine species listed by Cheng and others as salt marsh insects, and I also retrieved other published listings of marine associated insects that hadn't managed to get into worms, retrieved from my own independent search of the literature, doubtless incomplete, which I conducted using the Thomson Web of Science search engine. And I finished up with a final total of marine, brackish water and salt marsh insects that amounted to 1,600 species. And here's an example of a screenshot from my Excel spreadsheet. I classified all of the marine hexapods that I'd identified from the records according to their order, their suborder, the family, the genus, and the species. And these are the places where you can go back to find them. And this particular species here, up at the top of the list, is the delphacid bug Procalisia marginata. There's the picture. And this species is actually a native of North America, but it's a relatively recently introduced species into the UK, first recorded in 2008 in a Hampshire salt marsh near Southampton, where it feeds on the invasive grass Spartina anglica, itself an invasive non-native species. And this insect has colonized suitable habitat all along the south and southeast coasts of Britain and elsewhere in Europe with extreme rapidity. And this insect now reaches very high densities on Spartina. Well, that's just one example of the 1,600 species in the list. I've no doubt that my list of marine species of insect is not complete, but it's probably the best estimate yet. I haven't finished work on it yet, but I hope to publish this list in the peer-reviewed literature next year. And the main conclusion that I came to was that even after so much effort by so many entomologists over so many years, the total number of insect species that are known to live in or near the sea is indeed very small. The final total is only 1,600 species. Considering that around 1 million species of hexapods have been described, this is an absolutely tiny number that represents only 0.16% of the total hexapod species. In other words, 99.84% of insects don't live in the sea. It's possible, even probable, that that figure is an underestimate because, in general, entomologists don't bother to look for insects in or near the sea. Very few people specialize in marine insects. Probably you can count them on the fingers of a couple of hands. But it's very unlikely that the lack of insect species on my list is seriously in error. After all, the very small number of marine insect species is not due to a lack of seawater. 71% of the Earth's surface is covered by the oceans and only 29% is land. It's evident that the sea is in some way unsuitable for insect life. The small number of marine insects isn't due to a lack of animals that live in and around the oceans. It's commonly agreed that insects are much more diverse than any other kind of animal, with about 70% of invertebrate animal species being insects. But when we look into the sea, we find that the hexapods are almost invisible as a group. More than 99% of the animals in the sea are not insects. Less than 1%. Put another way, insects are incredibly poor competitors for niches in marine ecosystems. This lack of insects in the sea isn't because they don't like water. This nice picture here from the US National Science Foundation, it's an educational website, shows a nice illustration that plenty of insects live in fresh water. Beetles, dragonfly larvae, water bugs, and so on and so on. It's relatively simple to count the number of insect species that live on land and sea and fresh water. And here we are. These are my figures. They're a bit rough and ready, but million species of hexapod on land, 76,000 in freshwater, only 1,600 in the sea. These are the total areas of land, freshwater, and oceans available. We can easily calculate the density of species per square 1,000 kilometers in this way. And if we draw that out on a bar chart, you can see that there are plenty of species per 1,000 square kilometers on land and in fresh water. And in fact, there are more insect species in fresh water per area than there are on the land. But it's pathetic how few there are in the sea. This figure, I think, convincingly shows that the problem of the lack of insect species in marine environments is quite specific to the sea. Well, what kind of insects are they that live in the sea? Here on the left is another pie chart which shows the tiny fraction of marine animals that are hexapods, and you can see that there are lots of other kinds of invertebrate. But if we project this tiny fraction of hexapods into another pie chart all of their own, then we see that actually they aren't a sample of all of the insect orders. Actually, there are really only 4 insect orders: beetles or coleoptera, diptera, 2-winged flies, hemiptera, the true bugs, and lice. These are members of the order Psocodia. There are other insects in the sea, but they're all rather few in number. So it appears that some insects are much more suited than others to living in the sea. Now, in fact, this group here, the lice, it's arguable that these are not really adapted to the sea at all, but to a life of highly specialized parasitism in which they exploit marine vertebrates. And I'll return to this point in just a minute. So let's just unwrap that a bit more. Why are those 4 big orders of marine insects so important? Well, one possibility is that it's actually because those orders are very big anyway. They are orders of insect that have a large number of species. So what we can do is to plot the number of marine species against the total number of insect species in an order, and we can draw a line here that would be proportional to the number of species in the order. And what we see is that these orders here consistently produce more marine species than you'd expect. Remarkably, all 4 of these insect orders are wingless. The Archaeogonatha, the Poduromorpha, the Entomobryomorpha, these are all apterygote or wingless insects, very primitive kinds. And then here again is the Cercodia. These are the lice, and they too are wingless. So it's a reasonable conclusion. This striking winglessness is some kind of evolutionary adaptation to living in or near the sea, which evidently often involves the loss of an insect's wings. So there we are. These are the wingless orders, and this is the Cercodia. But most of the orders that don't have any marine representatives are simply too small to have even one seagoing member. We could make the hypothesis that what's happening here is simply that at random species are selected from insect orders to become adapted to the sea, and most insect orders are simply too small for this to be probable as an outcome. Well, there are actually a couple of examples of numerous insect orders which don't follow that rule. These two groups, the Lepidoptera and the Hymenoptera, have lots of species in the order, but they don't have any marine representatives at all. There seems to be something about those two orders of insect that is particularly incompatible with life at sea. And in the case of Lepidoptera, it may simply be that they have water-resistant cuticular scales, and that makes it difficult for them to live in water. In the case of the Hymenoptera, or ants, wasps and bees, it's probably two things. First of all, many Hymenoptera are specialized pollinators of flowering plants, and there's no call for such pollinators in the sea because there are no flowering plants in the sea either. And secondly, perhaps social organization isn't feasible in the sea, and the Hymenoptera are in many cases social insects. And maybe social organization is difficult in the sea because of the difficulty of an individual insect being able to stay in one place against powerful water currents. It's difficult to be social if you're constantly being buffeted by the waves. That's another way of saying that insects are specialized for flight, but it's much easier to fly in the air than in the water. So how did marine insects evolve? Was it a one-off event, or did adaptation to the ocean wave occur on multiple occasions? And to think about this, let's just examine what we know about the relatedness of different insect orders according to descent. That's to say, we'll look at the family tree of all insects, which is shown here. This is what we call a phylogeny. We can construct a family tree like this by grouping together insects that look alike. So here, for example, down at this end, the Odonata, the dragonflies and damselflies, and the mayflies, the Ephemeroptera, are grouped together because they have similar ways of folding their wings, and they're different in that from all other insects. So we say that these two orders are probably closely related together, and it looks from this kind of diagram as though these groups separated out from the other insects a long time ago, very early in evolution. But we can improve on the accuracy of a family tree like this very greatly by comparing the sequences of genes. And insects with similar genes are assumed to be probably very closely related. And when we do this, we find that this strongly confirms the hypothesis of relatedness based on anatomy. And in this way, we can build up a comprehensive family tree for all insects. And this is a recent conventional hexapod phylogram family tree that's based on both morphology and DNA sequences. And on the tree, I've marked in red where there are marine representatives. The thickness of the red bars is roughly proportional to the number of marine species that there are in each order. And it's feasible to imagine that the common ancestor of all hexapods, as shown by this dot down here, was already adapted to marine life, and that adaptation to freshwater and terrestrial environment came afterwards. And if you do that, then you have to assume that adaptation to marine life was regained on these occasions that are shown by these asterisks here. On the other hand, if actually the common ancestor of all the hexapods was already adapted to land, then actually we'd need even more asterisks than this, and we'd need to put another one here, or possibly even two here. So there would be either 10 or 11 recolonizations of the sea instead of only 9. So the take-home message from all of this is that freshwater or terrestrial hexapods must have re-entered the marine environment on many separate occasions. And actually, that suggests that it's not all that hard to become readapted to marine life, but maybe there are reasons why you don't get very successful if you do that. We get the same message if we apply the same approach to the terrestrial marine transition within individual insect orders. So let's have a look here at the Diptera, the two-winged flies. No fewer than 517 dipteran species are known to be closely associated with life in the sea for at least a part of their lives. But again, we see that there's evidence of multiple independent transitions from land to sea. This is shown slightly differently here, but it's the same thing. It's a family tree from deriving all dipteran insects that are alive today from a common ancestor. And we see that there are multiple occasions where different families of the order Diptera have readapted to the sea. There appear to be at least 10 and possibly as many as 24 independent transitions to marine life. And there are 21 of these asterisks here, but since the list of marine flies is almost certainly incomplete, the exact number of transitions is not really important. What is clear, though, is that there have been many such transitions and that they're independent. They're separated by other evolutionary events. So if we now zoom in on just one family of two-winged flies, the non-biting midges, or chironomid midges, then actually we see the same thing again. Again, there are multiple returns to marine life. This is a recently constructed family tree that's based on both shared anatomical features and DNA sequences. And even at this finer taxonomic level, we still find multiple independent transitions to life in and close to the sea. We see that there's no fewer than 8 and possibly as many as 11 independent origins of marine adaptations, which are again illustrated with asterisks here. In just 3 cases, which are shown by these large asterisks, is there evidence that there's been a transition to a seagoing way of life that was sufficiently successful to generate a number of different species, all from a single transition. These are what evolutionary biologists call daughter clades, and these asterisks show you that these were particularly successful transitions. But in general, the lesson is clear. There's no fundamental barrier among insects at any level to the colonization of marine environments, because it keeps happening repeatedly, again and again and again. But when it does happen, it's not very often that it gives rise to an adaptive radiation of a number of species. One exception to that remark is the marine lice, the parasites of marine mammals, the Pseudocodia. I mentioned earlier on that this is possibly a special case, so let's just look at this in a bit more detail. Being parasites, lice feed only on the blood or other tissues of vertebrates. And those lice that are found in the sea are all parasites of marine vertebrates. The majority are bird lice, feather lice, chewing lice, or Phthyraphthora. And each species is largely restricted to a single bird species host. These species of lice don't closely co-evolve with the host. So if you look at a phylogram of the lice, it doesn't correspond very well to a phylogram of the bird hosts. And this is probably something to do with the colonial nesting habits of seabirds. There are a smaller number of lice that are associated with seals and sea lions. This is the family Echinophthyridae, and these are occur only in the sea, and they're a sub division of the biting lice, or Ichnophthiridae. Human lice would come in this category, but the marine representatives are relatively few in number, and they feed exclusively on seals and sea lions. And it's been shown that these lice are indeed adapted to a life that's submerged in seawater some of the time. They're tolerant of high pressures, low oxygen tension, and this is very good when their hosts are diving deep in the sea. But lice of this kind can breed only when their hosts haul out of the sea to breed on the land. Marine mammals that don't leave the water to breed, like whales and dolphins, don't have lice at all. Instead, they have crustacean parasites from the family Siamidae, and this strongly suggests that the limitation of adaptation for these parasitic insects is something to do with reproduction. And that's a topic I'll come back to later. So, as I keep saying, there are altogether rather few insects that live in or near the sea, and this indicates that the repeated colonization of the sea or the seashore by insects leads only rarely to a line of evolutionary descent that persists. So why is it that insects aren't very good competitors in the sea? Well, here are some quotes from Lana Cheng. As far as we know, no marine insects remain submerged throughout their lives. That remains true. Almost all marine-dwelling insects live in the intertidal zone, spending a fraction of their lives underwater, most commonly in the egg, larval, and pupal stages. This is a much more recent paper, but actually that was obvious even in 1976. These facts imply that marine insects are okay at acquiring resources in the sea, but they don't reproduce well in the sea. So I would say perhaps it's an ecological or a life history problem. Now, other people have suggested that this might not be the case. There are some examples where people have discussed the possibility that it's a physiological problem. My old boss, Simon Madrill, years ago, suggested that the high salt content of seawater could be a problem. Insects have body fluids that are more dilute than the seawater, and therefore they have to expend a lot of energy to expel the inflow from of water into their bodies. But in fact, many species of insect prosper in hypersaline lakes, which shows that they can manage just fine in these difficult environments. But it may be that it's at a high energetic cost, and this might be a disadvantage to them in the sea when they have to compete with lots of other invertebrates which don't have to work so hard because they have body fluids with a higher osmotic potential. Well, that's true, but it may not be the only thing that we have to think about. Another possible physiological adaptation relates to breathing. Insects breathe air through a network of special air tubes inside their bodies. How can they breathe when they're underwater? Because actually these air tubes now don't open to the air. The problem can be overcome, and many freshwater insects like this Odonaton larva have special structures, gills, which allow oxygen to diffuse from surrounding water into the tracheal system inside the rest of the body. The tracheal system is no longer open to the air, but these gills can acquire oxygen and get rid of carbon dioxide. Simon Madrell pointed out that the trouble with this is it doesn't really work in deep water because the tracheal air-filled tracheal tubes inside the body can be compressed by water pressure so that the insects wouldn't be able to dive deeply, and they may face a particular problem in that many pelagic crustaceans migrate up and down in the water column in order to avoid predation by fish, and maybe insects just can't do that, and so they're poor competitors. These things are both possible. Another possible problem is with metamorphosis. Maybe it's hard for insects to molt and spread wings if they live underwater. But nevertheless, a few insects do manage this. So maybe it's a problem, but it's one that can be overcome. But what I want to point out to you is that insects differ from their crustacean relatives and almost from all other marine invertebrates in that they don't disperse as newly hatched larvae. Decapod crustaceans, like lobsters or shrimps, as in this picture here, they lay huge numbers of eggs which hatch into a very immature stage of development called a nauplius larva. And these newly hatched larvae are able to swim and to feed, but they're tiny. And they live in the plankton, and they're swept around by very forceful movements of water in the sea. Their movement is directed by ocean currents, and they have little or no control over where they finish up. It takes them a very long time to grow to the point that they can stop dispersing and settle in a suitable benthic environment. And at that point, they undergo a metamorphosis into an adult-like shape, but they continue to molt and get bigger in order to be able to produce the vast number of eggs that they need to overcome the terrific losses that occur in a life cycle like this. Insects, whether they are undergoing a partial metamorphosis like these hemimetabolous insects here, or a complete metamorphosis like these holometabolous insects here, they hatch out into larvae that their eggs are much bigger. They hatch out into larvae that can begin to feed and grow rapidly straight away. the newly hatched insect may look adultoid in its appearance straight away, or it may be that the larvae are specialized for feeding and have a worm-like shape, but boy can they feed. They're really specialized for rapid growth. So even in the case of tiny insects like aphids, landing and takeoff are not at random, as is necessary for crustacea, but the movement of the adult is there to provide the directed deposition of eggs to just the right place. These insects are deposited by their parents with great care in exactly the right place for successful feeding. And in both kinds of insects, the adult stage is large and well provisioned for flight. It's well equipped with lots of clever sense organs to enable it to navigate to exactly the right place. There's little left to chance. In other words, insects don't disperse to find the correct niche as larvae, they disperse as adults. And by doing that, they reduce the list of random chance larval mortality. And in marine invertebrates like lobsters, the losses due to mortality are catastrophic. There are different survival type curves here. And if you look at what happens in the case of a crustacean in the sea, like a lobster, you have what's called a type 3 survival curve, in which you have drastic losses and you finish up with only a tiny percentage of adults surviving. If you look at what happens in insects, this is a butterfly, you have a type 2 survival curve. These insects don't need to survive so long. Instead of needing to live for hundreds or even thousands of days, they're mature in only a few weeks. Moreover, the fecundity of the lobster is phenomenal. The lifetime fecundity for this species of lobster is to lay 1.6 million eggs in her life. The butterfly here, this blue butterfly, has a lifetime fecundity of only 60 eggs. These are only two examples, but in general, this very big difference in fecundity is the main fault line between the ecological strategies of marine invertebrates and insects. Now, it's a nice test of such an idea that we would try to discover an insect that laid its eggs in the sea. Actually, this is an example of an insect that was once thought to live entirely in the sea and to lay its eggs in the sea, but we now know that it doesn't. This insect was discovered a long time ago, 100 years ago, but recently it's been shown, quite contrary to what was previously thought, that this insect is now known to lay its eggs on the shore. It has a very short-lived adult stage, only 1 or 2 hours, in which the adult insects need to emerge to find mates, copulate on the water surface, and then the male midges drag the immobile female midges to a hard substrate where they lay eggs when the tide is low. The sound from the wave provides a cue to determine the direction of the shore in the dark. These insects emerge at night, and the insects then use their sensitive organ of hearing to find exactly the right place in which to lay their eggs. In other words, this is yet another example of how an apparently fully marine adapted insect turns out not to be. As far as reproduction goes, it's terrestrial. So if there is a convincing exception to Goss's rule that insects don't live in the sea, then surely it has to be this genus Halobates, the single well-known example of a truly marine insect. Now, there are numerous estuarine representatives of this genus of sea skater, all of which live on the surface of salty water during all of their lives. But 5 species of Halobates have colonized the open sea, and they never return to the land at all, even to reproduce. Halobates was discovered and described in the first quarter of the 19th century by this chap, von Eschholz. He's a German naturalist who joined a Russian voyage of exploration in this vessel, the Rurik, during 1815 to 1818, and the Rurik circumnavigated the globe at that time, and Eschholz discovered these marine water skaters, sea skaters, at that time. But the published reports of this expedition were not prominent in the world of science, and were largely overlooked until later. And the first published report in an English language journal of the marine Halobates species, the species that's now designated as Halobates micans, was that of Robert Templeton. And again, this was in the very first issue of the Transactions of the Royal Society of London in 1835. Remember, this is before Darwin gets home and is able to read it. And these insects are pretty spectacular. They're extremely hydrophobic, have lots of hairs, and they float very buoyantly on the surface of the sea. And I'm pretty sure that if Darwin had known about Halobates, he would have looked for it. Why didn't he know about Halobates? The answer is simple. Templeton's paper came out before he got back. In theory, Darwin could have known about Eschholz's 1822 description, but evidently he didn't. Even if he did, he may not have realized that Halobates micans was in fact a bona fide marine insect. Like Templeton himself, Darwin may simply have thought that the insect described by Eschholz had simply been blown out to sea. After all, other closely related water skaters are found only in brackish waters close to the shore. And there was no proper description of the biology of this insect and no understanding that it was a fully committed permanent inhabitant of the open sea until much later, when this chap, Francis Buchanan White, published a paper in 1883, more than 50 years after the initial discovery of ocean-going Halobates. Buchanan White was a member of the global scientific expedition of HMS Challenger, which took place in 1872. And the extraordinary lifestyle of Halobates was now revealed. We now know so much more about Halobates, largely due to the work of Lana Cheng and her associates and students. They're ocean-going members of the family Geridae, the pond skaters, and they're the only insects to live all of their lives on the open sea. This is a phylogram of the Geridae, and the ancestral condition is that these insects are adapted to living on the surface of fresh water, mostly in still water such as ponds and lakes. But at the point indicated by this arrow, there's an apparently irreversible evolutionary change that allowed the colonization of coastal salt water. This appears to be a single evolutionary transition. And it's then followed by extensive radiation, mostly within the genus Halobates. And there are just these few independent later transitions marked by these purple arrows, which lead to the adoption of a fully oceanic ocean life with no return to land. But as Lana Cheng commented, as far as we know, no marine insects remain submerged throughout their lives. Is Halobates really an exception to that principle? No. Recent research has in fact shown within the last few years that Halobates has numerous adaptations of its body cuticle, including superfine hairs, special grooming apparatus, a coating of superhydrophobic waxes that enable it to avoid being submerged by seawater, and Halobates literally lives on top of the sea and not in it. And when it comes to reproduction, again, Halobates avoids rather than solves the problems of the dangers posed by the sea. These water skaters lay their eggs on floating objects or flotsam, such as seabird feathers, driftwood, plastic. Discarded fishing gear is popular. Even other members of the same species may be utilised. The specialist habitat of the ocean-going Halobates species is the surface of the water, not underneath it. The offspring of sea skaters are carefully deposited by their mother on objects that can be relied upon to float. They're much less liable there to be eaten by predators like fish. Once again, we're seeing that marine insects avoid the ecological problems posed by reproducing in the sea rather than truly adapting to it. So here are some key points of my lecture. Very few insects live in the sea. Adaptation to marine life is taking place on a large number of occasions. Very few examples of marine insects that have successfully radiated. Parasites appear to be an exception. Maybe the problem is the low fertility of insects compared to marine invertebrates. They appear to be highly specialized for highly targeted egg laying with low larval mortality, and that's a strategy that doesn't work in the sea. Even Halobates doesn't actually live in the sea. Instead, it lives on top of it. Thus, I would say that marine insects aren't adapted to live in the sea in the way that pinniped mammals like whales and dolphins are. Instead, they're much more like seals and sea lions, which have to get out of the sea in order to breathe. Well, this is where I grew up as a child, and I played on the beach. Notice the great quantities of washed up seaweed debris, which is occupied by hundreds and thousands of marine flies of the genus Coelopa. Perhaps this explains why I find the subject so fascinating. If you want to follow up this topic, you could do worse than read the review that I wrote in 2023 for the Royal Entomological Society's members magazine, Antenna. And you can find it on the RES website if you're a member or a fellow. Alternatively, I think that you'll be able to get it from the Ento Live website. Thanks for listening.